1 second. There we go. I am unmuted and hopefully able to be seen by all of those who are joining remotely. I am Judge Megan McCoy, and I have been invited to speak regarding advancing the rule of law now, which is the American Bar Association's topic for Law Day 2021. I would like to say a few things first to keep expectations very low. I invited a very broad audience to sit in today. I've invited court staff who needs to have continuing education. I've invited attorneys who also need continuing education credits. And I've invited local schools to sort of tune in. And so thinking how we have community members, we have people who are involved in the law and in the court system, we have people who are joining us who are a part of the school system. I am sort of forced to be very broad in what I get to talk about today, but I feel like I have a very broad topic that I get to talk about, and that is the rule of law. And I guess the first thing that we have to kind of think about is, what is Law Day? And apparently Law Day is held on May 1st of every year. I have yet to get any flowers, bouquets, celebratory letters throughout my career in law. I have been an attorney since 2006, and very few people have come to me and said, let's celebrate Law Day together. And it is an interesting day in which the role of law in our society gets to be respected and given sort of its due. And we get to talk about what the law means and what the legal profession is able to provide. And I do think that that might be part of why I'm excited to speak today, because there are people who perhaps have felt the wrong end of the law and are a little bit unhappy with the way the process works, or there are people who are unhappy with being in the legal profession. And I love my job. I love my job every single day. I love the law. I love the rule of law. And I sort of, as I prepared this presentation, thought about all of these million things that I get to do, that my court gets to do, and how we get to serve our community. And so hopefully some of the things that we're able to talk about today will be things that resonate with those who are listening. But I am so happy that there is a day in which we get to kind of sit down and say, you know who loves rules? We do. And so with that, let me see if I can make this a little bit smaller for those in person. Let's see. There we go. The rule of law and advancing it is the topic that we have before us. And the rule of law is this idea that the laws apply equally to all persons, that no one is above the law and everyone is treated equally under the law. And one of the ways that I kind of try to break down what it is that is the rule of law is stop thinking about criminal court cases and who's guilty of what. Don't just think about divorce cases or who's getting evicted or what are the rules within a court. Start really thinking smaller. Start thinking about your friends and your family. And in your family, there is a rule of law and there are expectations set by parents of their children. And there are expectations within every board game. And that is, I think, one of the most universal systems of law that all of us have to deal with is when you sit down and you go to play Uno, or you're sitting down with a 4-year-old and playing Trouble, there are certain rules that have to be upheld. And everyone goes into that game with the same expectations that they apply to everyone playing the game equally. My 5-year-old vehemently denies that any of the rules apply to him. And that would make the 11-year-old suddenly go into a spiral about how this is unfair because justice is not served if he doesn't have the same issues of getting bumped to the beginning of the game when he is landed on. And just that tiny conflict within a board game is the same conflict that would happen in any society in which people find friction or that the laws are not apparently applied fairly. And so one of my best examples, honestly, is in the game of Uno. If you play a draw 4 wild card and you have a card of the color that you played it on, you yourself could get called out for bluffing and draw 8. And I want to say that I have yet to meet a human being who has also read the rules of Uno and knows that rule. And my children are inherently the only children, I think, in the world that are aware of this law that is of Uno, where, but if you're bluffing, there's a huge consequence to putting down that draw 4. And it's an interesting thing to think about. People come into this game and they don't know the rules or they haven't read the rules. And a lot of people play card games or dominoes with house rules. And in looking at what is your house rule, that's something that perhaps hasn't been evolving over time or maybe doesn't address a certain situation. And suddenly there is a conflict that is created because people don't know what the rules of the game are, or they don't know how to move forward within that. And so I think of the rule of law and what I get to do in my everyday life as a Superior Court judge. And I think about what we in the court system get to do is we have a set of rules. They're written down, they're known because that's the rule of law. And they apply to everyone before us equally. And there are cases where I just think, this one doesn't fit. This doesn't fit very well. But if you look at all of the rules, each case filters through the same rules and the same people are treated fairly in those rules. And hopefully, though there is the same discontent of children playing a board game at times and the same sort of disagreements happen, hopefully over time, that does give the ability for us to look at this rule of law within our country and say, I understand what the rules are that apply to me, that apply to the others, and I know how to have those applied fairly. And so looking to these same laws have to apply to everyone, and everyone is treated equally under the law. That is something that I hear a lot about in our community, is people who feel like there is a different standard for them or that they are not served appropriately. There are always people who say the courts don't respect this type of person, be it a mother or a father. They don't see children, or they don't understand that in my situation, I am different and I'm not treated the same. And when people feel that way, it affects our whole community because they don't feel like they can go to the courts and they don't feel like they can have a fair resolution. If they don't think that the police are acting fairly, there are so many parts of our communities that don't believe the laws are enforced appropriately. And so that starts to break away that rule of law, because the rule of law is based on everyone being treated fairly and believing they are treated fairly. And so within this topic, advancing the rule of law now, the rule of law in America is within the bedrock of our institutions. And we, the people, share that responsibility to advance the rule of law, to promote that rule of law, to defend liberty, to pursue justice. And I love the idea that this is not just simply a judge's job. This is not simply each attorney's job. This is everyone's job to really know what's going on in your community. What are the laws? How are they being enforced? What's going on in the courts? Because that transparency and that active engagement from our community is what allows us to grow and to be able to share. And so, looking at beyond America, there are countries throughout this world that strive to uphold trust in the system. And looking at what are the basic principles, there's that idea that no one's above the law, no one gets treated differently by the law. Everyone is treated equally under that law. And so if the law only applies to certain citizens, is that a valid law, and does it promote trust? In just a second. And if everyone is held accountable to those same laws, it promotes that fairness principle. Are there clear and fair processes for enforcing the laws? Do we get to see what happens? And are we able to see how the police are policing? There are more and more persons who are involved in watching police cameras. There are more and more citizens who are involved in taking videos of what's going on in their community, and it promotes transparency. We get to see how the laws are enforced. We get to see how they are treated within a court system. And now more than ever, there is this absolutely available internationally process where the courts are public, the investigations become public, and we can all get to look at that and really see what is happening, and are these laws being done fairly? If that was all concealed and hidden away from the public, there could not be that same level of trust in us. And that is part of the independent judiciary and the idea that within our community, our rights are all respected, not just the rights of some, but the rights of all. And it's interesting to think how we as a country have evolved, in which we have granted all citizens the same equal protection under the laws, that no human is worth less than any other human. And that is by race, that is by gender, that is the idea that any person can be given the same rights under the law, under the Constitution, and they can come into court and be treated equally. And just the circumstances that they bring to the court are what is brought before us. And so when we think about why would we care about the rule of law, I know at least one person in the audience is really into philosophy, and that one person in my audience is probably really excited to be able to talk about what it is and how we should do this and just the ideas of it. But beyond that one person, I think that there is a full community of people who sort of get turned off by the idea of this very broad topic, that it's the law and they don't really want to think beyond that. And the way that the law works affects us in our everyday life. It affects your housing, it affects your health, it affects you being either charged with a crime or not. If you're a victim, that person who victimized you being charged with a crime or not, it affects almost every aspect of your life. And it needs to be fair. It needs to be in writing. It needs to be known. And so looking sort of at those basic tenets of what is the rule of law, the government is bound by the law because we live in a government of laws, not men. And I absolutely am a nerd because I love this Federalist paper quote, because if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We wouldn't need laws if all of us just woke up in the morning and thought, you know what I'm going to do today? Just good for others. And if every other person was doing that, we were all just working together, there would be no need for these rules of Uno, because my family would not break down over the rules of a board game and really have trouble remembering what a 6 means in trouble. And if they're written down, it dissipates that conflict. We've all decided these are the rules that we live by. And it gets more and more complex because we'll say, look, the number one rule, we're just not going to kill each other. We're going to live together. We're just not going to kill each other. And then they say, well, but also I want my contracts to have rules about them, because if I agree to something, I want that other person to definitely have to do their side of things if I did my side of things. And if I don't get him to do what he said he'd do, I want to go to someone who makes him do it. If I build you a house and you don't pay for it, I want to have somewhere I can go so I can collect what is due to me. And so it starts getting more complex as we all start living together more. We're beyond being tribal or small communities. We are this massive governmental system, and it starts to get more and more complex. And as the government gets bigger and bigger, and as we look at, we have local city governments, we have county, we have states, we have federal. And in framing each of those governments, we have to have checks and we have to have balances, and those governments have to be accountable to the people and do their will, because you must first enable the government to control the governed, and then you have to somehow get it to control itself, because absolute power cannot be just given. And it is that moment where you realize an informed citizenry is necessary. Having people who know what they are doing and what happens in their community is necessary to hold the government accountable. And it is part of why the courts are open to the public. Anyone can come in and sit in and see what's going on. There's open meeting laws where the legislators have to keep their meetings open to the public. That which your government does is mandated to be open so that the citizens can be watching and holding everyone accountable to ensure that the government is doing its job and being fair, and that they can be removed or they can be disbanded if necessary. And so that is the first big idea of when you create a rule of laws, who is enforcing it? How do we create this government board? But also it needs to be accountable to the people that it serves. There is, under the rule of law, a principle, an idea that the laws must be shared openly and enforced fairly. And shared openly, Arizona's laws, it's amazing to me how few people know any amount of the laws. And I think it's even attorneys, we don't know all of the ins and outs of any portion of the laws. But every time I've gone to go and speak at schools or in the community about certain niche areas of the law, it is terrifying how some of these things that have laws that affect your everyday life, no one really knows about them, and no one knows the ins and outs of them or how they can affect your life. And that has to do with your lease agreements, that has to do with your credit cards, that has to do with your relationships and what it means to be married, and then what it takes to get divorced. And each of these is such an interesting and personal area, and there are laws about it. There are laws that take place and are publicly published that are difficult sometimes for even lawyers to read. And it is so interesting to me that they are not more well known throughout a community, and that there is so much mistake in the ways that people discuss, this is probably a law, or it probably works like this. And they rely on that without ever double checking it. And it can really affect everyone's lives and the ways that they try to fix it later. Be that a verbal agreement about having to repay a debt, or be that the ways in which you think that your your case is going to be heard during a divorce. It's interesting how much this law is published, but that people do not have the time or ability to process it all. There is a huge difficulty in being able to afford an attorney for many people. And so the laws are out there, but they are at times very difficult for us to process. And that's part of why the courts have a law library that is available, because people don't even really always know where to look, and why there is an availability of forms and different things on our websites. And that's not just Mohave. That's almost every court is trying to say, how can we help you figure out what you need to do to be able to come before us and resolve your issues, resolve those conflicts. And they need to be enforced fairly. And so bringing up another quote that is a quote that I absolutely loved as well is Thomas Paine stating, "But where, some say, is the King of America? And in America, the law is king. For in absolute governments, the king is law. And so in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought be no other." And this is the idea that within America, we don't have royalty. We don't have a single person that stands for the entire government. We have laws. We have laws that grant powers to the government. And so kind of like I was saying, the government has to be restrained. The government only has the power that is granted to it. And there are a lot of times where people want, say, a judge or a police officer to do something, and there is no authority in the law for them to do the thing. And they must say, no, I cannot do that. And so an example within the courts is if there is a conflict between two people, there is a right to notice. And so if no one told you there's a court hearing, it is upon the court in many circumstances to say, I cannot help you unless both of you are able to be present, unless both of you know what is happening here in court today. Because we do not hold secret court. We have emergency court, and it is a very high standard to be able to have an emergency hearing. And looking at that just basic principle, you're both entitled to know what's going on and be here, because the court has no authority over you. The laws cannot be applied to you if you have not been told to come to court. And that is something where in criminal court, there are warrants. In other sides of the court, there are so many persons trying to effect service in so many ways, and give that paperwork to someone and say, come to court, we need to resolve our issue. And so in America, there is no person that's saying, no, I don't like this. We're going to go and take care of it. And I was thinking about this particular quote and kind of the way it relates to really sort of deep history, I guess, is the way to think of, like Sherwood Forest or way back in time, and thinking there are all these stories of the king being able to just do as he wishes. And you may not have known that that day you were going to offend someone, or you were going to misstep, and you were going about your business. And if you insulted someone that was the king's man or the king, you could just be picked up, taken away, and no one sees you again, because the king can decide what happened, and the king can decide what the punishment is. And the king sort of decides that day what the law is and whether he felt it was good or bad. And if there is no published law that we all have to look at, those UNO rules that we have to say, does that apply? Who goes first? The youngest? Done. If there is no written rule, there is no rule. It's just how that person feels that day. And I feel like thinking smaller, thinking like your family. There are days where parents say, because I said so. And there are days that parents are just annoyed. And there are days that parents are thinking, I should have made a rule against this, and I did not. If there is no rule in place and kids are not told you cannot do the thing, those kids are really upset when parents suddenly come down heavy on them and say no. you can't do that in the moment, or in which they're punished when they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. And so a lot of the time, the actual offense in those moments is a parent saying stop and a child saying no. And I feel like the ultimate rule of law in every household and in court is the idea that when you are told no, there are certain people you cannot disobey. And disobeying your parent or disobeying a court order, those are things that are punishable. And so even if sounding annoying on a car trip perhaps was not a rule that was made, stopping when your parent tells you to stop is absolutely a rule of law in most families. And failing to comply with that is going to have a consequence. And so within this rule of law, I like the bottom line idea that we all have to have the same set of rules, the same rule book, and be able to look to those and say, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to my case? And we do not look to a person to say, how does this judge feel about it? It's what is the law and how do you apply it? And so that brings us to the judiciary has to remain independent and judges must be fair and impartial. And one of the things that I've really learned since I've become a judge is people think judges know everything. And it's really hard to tell them judges literally have to come to the case and know nothing. I have to know nothing, or I don't get to be the judge on the case. If I knew the people, that case would have to go to a different judge because I don't know that I could be fair. I don't know that I could be impartial. If I was a witness to that accident, I couldn't be the person making impartial and fair decisions based on the law and based on court. I'd be a witness. I'd be involved in the case. And so the idea that judges come to a case sort of an empty vessel, who are ready to listen, who are ready to learn, who are going to hear testimony or evidence about a case, that keeps us fair, that keeps us impartial and separate from the people who are coming before us. And my quote on that is, there can be no free society without law administered through an independent judiciary. And if one man can be allowed to determine for himself what is law, every man can. And that would lead to chaos and tyranny and legal process. That which we do here in court is an essential part of the democratic process. Because if every man out in society can write his own rules, we're back down to chaos. And we have to start back at that rule 1, hopefully don't kill anyone. And going from there, don't hurt anyone. Going from there to the next rule of how traffic lights should work, process. And so you hit the big ones first, but this is absolutely so important that there be a courthouse where people can come and trust that their issues can be resolved. And within Arizona, there is such a focus on sort of innovating and giving people access. Giving people access to court is something that so many people within the courts and the systems that go on behind these scenes, that is so much time and effort. And as the entire nation shut down over the past year, here and there, the courts had to innovate and figure out how to be open for people and how to ensure that the emergency matters were heard, how to ensure that cases and issues could be processed appropriately. Because without this court to go to, there are no orders of protection. Without a court to go to, there are no divorces. Without a court to go to, there is no child support or let's see, there's so many things we do here. There's no oversight over other government agencies. There would be arrests without any check on those arrests. There would be children removed from their homes without judicial oversight. There are things that we in the courts do every day that needed to be seen, that needed to be heard. And in the very early days of quarantine and trying to figure out how to safely do that, our courts opened up into Zoom, into phone appearances, into figuring out who needed to be physically here, who needed to be heard remote, and how to make sure that everyone had access to the court when they needed it. And as of 2021, we are still open and we are still here and welcoming people to be able to resolve those disputes, because we need to be able to help our citizens, and we need to be open in order for them to be seen, for them to be heard. And that is something I tell people basically every day is, please come to court. Please show back up, because a lot of people who are not attorneys have a level of panic when they are appearing by phone, and they feel invisible. They're much more likely to start interrupting, panicking and yelling. It is a scary thing for many people to come to court. And if you are by phone and you are invisible and you can't see me, and the fact that I am not scary at all, I am just a judge who is asking questions because I need the answers. And I can't see those people who are on the phone. Kind of like I can't see all these people who are logged in on remote and digital platforms. And the idea that I don't know when someone is scared, and I don't know when they look panicked at a point that I don't think they should. And it doesn't give me as a judge that ability to sort of back up and say, where did I lose you? You look really confused. What do you need to tell me? Because it's clear you need to tell me something. And it has been an evolution for us as judges to figure out how to address that when people are not always visible, and how to encourage people to come back into court so that those disputes can be heard. And so an open and independent judiciary, the fact that our doors are open, that anyone who has an issue can come forward. And then that also just covers the idea that nothing we do is that secretive. We are held accountable to a higher court. There are levels of review that are held so that if I make a mistake and I heard something wrong, or I looked at the law and I thought of it one way, there are levels of review so that appellate courts can look at what we do. The citizens can watch what we do, and there are those who do, and there are newspapers who do. And many of our judges are elected officials and have to go through that sort of review to remain independent. And even if they are not held accountable by voters, they are held accountable by oversight, and the idea that we are held to ethical ideals of fairness and impartiality so that our citizens can trust in us. And so looking to advancing the law and thinking about what are the challenges that we face today in upholding the rule of law? What are we doing? What's in the future? And this is kind of thinking about what's going on today that affects those things that are not just happening in the times of kings or the times of founding our nation and writing down "We the People" in really pretty font on a nice piece of paper and getting a lot of signatures on it. What's going on now? And there's a lot of discussion now about what is actual fairness, and there needs to be a perception of fairness. And that roots down into our judges. We can be recused, we can be taken off of a case, we can take ourselves off of a case if we have an actual bias. If my friend is sitting there, I'm not going to hear their case. But there can also be this idea that there's a perception that this would not be fair. And so there are cases where I don't really know these people, but the way that the story could be written, the way the public would look at it, this is a small town. The public needs to know that this is fair. And if this is, childhood friend that I haven't talked to in 20 years, and this is someone that I don't know at all, it doesn't look as fair. And so there are cases where judges have to say, you know what, I play softball with this law enforcement officer. I'm on the Rotary Club with this attorney. I have worked with this other person for 30 years. I can be fair, but do either of you have a problem with any of my known connections to this case? Because you have a right to say, I want to feel like it's fair, not just that it's actually fair. And this works on the laws too, because there are countries that have laws that say women can't drive. And that's not fair. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, I don't think that's fair, because I would like the same opportunity to lose my license for driving poorly like any other citizen. I'm not going to say I'm an amazing driver, but I just want the same laws and the same protections as any other driver. And there are laws that throughout history have been intended to be good, but don't cover all people in the same fair way. And so if I am looking at a law, I have to make sure that that is a law that is tailored specifically, that is doing what it is supposed to be doing, that it is fair, so that there is no citizen above or below the law that is being run over by the law. And there also needs to be actual fairness in law enforcement. And this is something that across this country, people are asking, and it's a very difficult thing to analyze, because there are individual cases, and that's what the courts can never look at, is individual cases, and say, in this individual case, this was excessive force, or this was a case where there was not a reason to arrest, or this was a case where there was, and we process things one at a time. But thinking about actual fairness and a perception of fairness, there are many people from many communities, be it based on their race, be it based on their nationality, their indigent or poverty status. There are so many people across this country who feel as though they are other and that they cannot have fairness within the courts. And it is so important that we, as we move forward, think about the rule of law and think about how we can promote access to everyone, that they feel that they are covered under the laws, that they are being treated fairly within law enforcement, within each of the ways in which the laws are put forward. And ultimately, once all of that stuff happens, that they are treated fairly within the courts. And one of the biggest obstacles within this county to people actually coming to court can simply be our geography. And it's something that I think many people don't even think about, but we are so spread out that there are people who have to drive hours to come to court. There are people who have to drive several hours to come to court. And there are people who do not have the gas money. There are people who do not have a car. There are people who point to our system and say, I don't even have a good bus system to take to get there. And it is a real issue of access. And it can make people feel like it's unfair because they can't get there, or they can't put together the paperwork because they are disabled in any way, because they don't have the skills to be able to read it and really understand those rules that are put out. And there are so many pages of rules because this is the law and it can get complicated. And I look to the work of the courts in that area and how hard we have worked to ensure that there is access to the courthouse, that we are opening up so many ways in which people can appear remotely. We are opening up so many ways in which people can find the forms online, that they can try to struggle through those, that they can consult with a law librarian and make sure they at least have the right forms to do what they think they're doing, that they can get information so that they can resolve whatever it is that they need. And that is an enormous step, because there are people who are living in another state who still have Arizona court orders, and custody has changed 7 times since the last time they went to court. And they just need to struggle through and figure out how to get the court orders to match reality, and how to protect children or protect what's going on, or at least stop child support. If someone's been paying child support while they have a child that's already like in their own care, and the other parent has stopped caring for the child, those are things that need to be able to be brought before the court. And those are the people least likely to have an attorney. Those are the people who are least likely to be quick about filing and struggle to find the door in and figure out how to bring this before us. And so this perception of fairness, it's not simply in what the judges are deciding. It's making sure that people feel free to just come in the front door and find a way to get here and be seen, and that they trust in us enough to do so. And so another really interesting area of what's going on in today's world, and that we all sort of need to be aware of, and it's impacted in the rule of law, is the right to a fair election and an open process. And this is, so many things, but it's recounts and recalls and voter rolls and rules and procedures and integrity. And it's so exciting if you're me and you're the person who thought, I need to be a political science major because I need to know more about this stuff. And I know that many people are not as excited about it, but I think that what gets lost when we think about big and we think national is that these are local. There are local issues in our own community about what does it mean to actually reside in the community that you serve. There are local issues about what can be done to recall an elected official that has gone against what you believe is the will of the voter. And these are things that come to court. These are things that people, normal, average people, make come to court so that there can be oversight, so that there can be fairness in the process. And they say, these are the rules. Did people follow these rules? Because I don't think these people followed these rules. And with that, there can be a court case. And even recently, there have been court cases in Mohave County about whether signatures were collected appropriately, about whether the voter rolls are maintained appropriately. In Arizona, there's a lot of discussion about who should be permanently on an early voter list, who should be on those voter rolls. How do we keep integrity in the system while also ensuring that the public has access? These are things that are discussed and are being worked on at almost every area of the government, from law enforcement to local governments to bigger governments and within the courts. And we need to know how this is done, and we need to have a process that we can trust it is being supervised. And this is such an interesting area right now in which we look to how much transparency do we have? How much are people able to see what's going on? And there are so many lawsuits across the whole country right now about citizens wanting to know how are recounts being done, whether recounts need to be done, whether recounts can be done, and to really know who are our elected officials and was this done properly. And I think that it is exciting to me to see citizens coming forward and saying, I need an open process. I need to see how this is done so that I can believe in this. There have been, over the past year, another topic, health laws, and this is an entire balancing act. It is the idea that there are people's rights that must be protected and must be observed, but there are also government needs, and throughout time, those have been exercised in times of war and in times of health crisis. And there have been many times in which normal citizens, business owners, and persons who live in our community and across this nation who have said, I don't think these laws are right, or I don't think they're being enforced fairly. And as each of our cities and states has had to deal with, when are masks required? Will they be required? There is judicial oversight over whether those laws are being written fairly, over whether they are enforced fairly, whether they are constitutional. And that has to do with masks. That has to do with who is essential. That has to do with religious liberty rights, the impact and effect on people's right to gather. These are constitutional rights. And there is a weighing and a balancing that must be made. And it is a time where citizens get involved and say what they need and what they don't need. And there are people on each side of this equation. And looking at all of the different laws that have gone on in the past year, they've included curfews, they've included quarantines, They've included things that many of us have not seen in our lifetimes, and they are new. And there are people who have never had to deal with this, trying to figure out how to run a government that has decided these are needed and how to weigh and balance that. There are government workers that are doing so many things they never thought they would have to do. And looking at each of these, it is a balancing act that has to sort of take into account what is the need of the many and also respect the rights of each individual. And at what point is there a trade-off? And at what point is there allowed to be a trade-off? And it is a moment where, again, I am really happy I'm a judge instead of a legislator, instead of someone who is trying to figure these things out themselves, because I get to wait and see what people bring me, and wait and see what the evidence is, and wait and see what they tell me the science shows is necessary. And I get to just hold off on making that decision because it is not yet mine to make. And it really shows why I love what I do, because I love getting all of the information and having to hold people to their burden and say, why do you think you need this? How is this being done? What's going on? And get all of that information, and I get to process it and sort of hold people accountable in that way. And so this has been an interesting year as people have figured out what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do, and where they are allowed to go within this legislation for health and for safety. And so one of the things I would like to just throw out there, because I know I have students and I have attorneys and I have court staff, is the idea of think global, but act local. Think about what's going on. Think about what's going on everywhere, because what's going on everywhere is happening here too. And I feel like there's a lot of people who sort of look at me shocked a lot of the times and say, oh my goodness, even in Mohave County, these things exist. And be informed. Really look at what's going on and what you care about, and then be an involved citizen. Know what's going on in your courts. Know what's going on in your community. If you haven't ever sat through a day of court, the courts are open. And if you haven't really found out how law enforcement does what they do, they're open to discussing it with you, which is a strange thing, I think, for many people to say, which is, can I go for a ride along? What can I do with law enforcement? How are they doing what they do? They have people that field these phone calls that have to figure out how this works. And becoming an informed citizen within your community only strengthens your community's rule of law, because it is being held accountable, not just to the courts and not just to the police and not just to those of us who this is our job and we love it, but to the citizens who are the people that we serve. And so to get credit for this presentation, and I'm going to just have to talk for a few more minutes, I have, for the attorneys, contact F. Shade at courts.az.gov. He has certificates for you. I have court employees. You need to contact Valerie for your certificates for Kojak credit. And let's see, I wanted to see. I don't see any questions in the chat. If there's anyone who had any questions or anything to add, feel free to chat in the chat area. I don't know if that's enabled. I just see court admin. And then, what was that? It's enabled? Okay. And then if anyone wants to just take a few minutes to transition to the next portion of our presentation, I'm open to that too. I see people loitering in the back. That's you. Loitering. All right. No?
I have questions. I just don't.
No. I'll welcome questions or comments. Take a few minutes, Mr. McPhillips.
So, premise to my question.
Yes.
You mentioned that jurisprudence question.
Yes.
You mentioned that the appellate courts would ding you for a fact problem and a law problem, but that's not exactly true, is it? My counter argument to that would be they will ding you for the law all day, every day, quickly.
Well, they'll ding me for the facts too.
But for the facts, they give you great deference.
If the facts are in conflict and there is evidence to support my findings, they give deference to the fact that I'm the person sitting here, that I'm the person who can see how that witness testified, whether they were seemingly open or whether they hesitated. I get to be the judge of credibility. I get to be the judge of a lot of different things. But if I found a certain fact and there was no evidence to support it, I would absolutely get dinged for that, because it could just be me assuming a fact based on I have 1 and 2, so I assume 3 is there. And I'm not allowed to assume 3 is there. And so there are many times the courts make findings that are perhaps not supported in the evidence. And that is only really because if it was brought up here in court, we would resolve it. But there are many times it is only really revealed through the reading of transcripts, and then the Court of Appeals would send it back for further information on that, or just saying you heard it wrong.
But you're not giving great deference in the law.
No, I'm not giving great
Okay,
deference.
and that's the difference look, this is exactly what I'm trying to get at. So that's my premise. It goes to what Jerome Frank was saying probably since the 30s. His premise was, and I can't speak like him, but his premise was simply put that the courts will not be overturned on issues of fact, and that is the problem with American law. That while the law is written in concrete, the courts can determine, they've given great deference as to fact. So that's the jurisprudential problem with American law in Jerome Frank's mind. So that's my premise.
Okay.
Question, implicit bias.
Question?
Yeah, implicit bias. Is there
That's
a
not a question,
concern?
that's a statement.
It is a statement. Is there a concern now, looking at what is happening today, some of the things you've touched upon, do you think that there is a concern now that we've re-engaged with this concept of implicit bias, that this is a weakness in our legal system?
I think that many of us have been aware of implicit bias throughout at least our legal careers. I think that we're all very aware that those people that are from backgrounds the same as us are more likely to be people we understand, are more likely to use the words we understand, are more likely to communicate in a way that we deem credible, and that it is absolutely something that many jury instructions that have been used for decades are trying to address, and that many persons in the courthouse, either in opening or in arguments, are trying to address the idea that you may have never been an 8-year-old girl who lived in Bullhead City, but one testified. And if you've not been around 8-year-old children, you might not understand that spinning in her chair is a normal 8-year-old girl, not someone who is automatically trying to sort of offend you or disrespect you, but that's what that child does when nervous. And I think that can apply to going across gender boundaries, across race boundaries, across wealth, in any way that you are finding someone who is different from you. They have lived a different life, they have lived different experiences, and they express it differently. There are concepts as to beyond emotional intelligence, who is able to communicate and who is able to understand. And it is sort of all of our job to try to understand and how to communicate better with people who are different from us. And that's why it's so important locally, say, that law enforcement and the courts are aware of what our tribal members are within their culture and how they represent themselves differently. And it may not be intended disrespect, that they don't make eye contact or that they are not as vocal within my courtroom, and that it is difficult for them to do certain services because they are further away. And those are things that we who are members of the court need to be made aware of, as to anyone who is different from us, be able to step back and think, how can I bridge this? How can I better understand this person and better understand how to assess what is going on in my courtroom? Because there are sort of infinite ways in which we are all different. And there are so many ways that people have difficulty communicating across those divides. And so I think that within courts, it is absolutely important to really understand that we need to take a second. Anytime there is someone in the courtroom and they are either across a gender divide or a racial divide, cultural divide, age divide, see whether that person is intending disrespect or if they are simply from a different world, and really try to make sure that you hold those implicit biases, those things that you hold against people because you were raised within your family, with your rules, with your way, and they weren't given the same UNO instructions that you were given. They're going to behave differently. They're going to play this game differently. And so it's absolutely important that people throughout the law process are aware that we are all different and sort of tend toward finding understanding rather than judgment or conflict. That answer anything you said?
Yes.
Okay. And so is there any other question to follow up on, Mr. McPhillips, or just way more Mr. McPhillips?
Because there could be more Mr. McPhillips. I mean, you guys really should talk now.
Yeah, please, somebody else.
Yeah, we don't want me to get into the Catholic saint / legal philosophers and stuff.
We
that would be horrible.
don't need to go down that path. And so, honestly, I feel honored to have been allowed to present on this topic. I think it is so interesting, and I think that when anyone is encountering sort of the rules within their life, I'm hoping that people that were listening are kind of thinking about this as they play, say, Chutes and Ladders, and as they suddenly realize there's instructions in those board games that they were ignoring. And I hope that that tends to help everyone take that small, tiny, concrete way of explaining what are the rules and how is there conflict if those rules don't make sense, and apply it even bigger to what happens within our courts. And it shows how very important it is that our citizens and that our population get engaged and are involved in each of those aspects of what happens within our government, so that the government is accountable to the people, so that we do the will of the people, and so that we are better educated to be able to do that. Because at the end of the day, we are humans just striving our very best to give what we can give to the community in this role. And so I am going to say that's very close to 1:15, and we can swap out to whatever is next. And so are we cutting this feed and going somewhere else, or are people coming in here? Okay, perfect. And so with that, who is up next? Kip?
Well, I think we were just here to take the answer question.
Yes, and then we'll go there. That's what I'm saying is who's, all right.
And so we have up next, after this hour-long presentation, we have a 15 minutes on kind of court jobs and things that are going on within the court. And I know that we have persons who are available who sort of represent those different roles. And within the courts, we have various positions. I think that people tend to think, I'm going to go into law, I'm going to be a lawyer, I argue a lot. And that is the wrongest reason to go be a lawyer. If you think I settle arguments a lot, I negotiate and compromise a lot, that's far more what a lawyer does in their everyday life also. what they do is they read those UNO rules and they get to explain them to everyone else for the rest of their lives. They get to be the person who says, ooh, subsection 3 within the monopoly rules says, and everyone else is annoyed at them for the rest of their lives. And that truly is a huge part of a lawyer's job, is knowing the rules, knowing how to look at the rules, knowing how to interpret the rules, and knowing how to explain the rules. There are so many people involved in sort of helping jobs within the courts that are not those lawyers. There are persons who work here who conduct mediations. They speak to people who have a conflict and sort of find out if those people can come to some agreement or a partial agreement, figure out what's happening in their lives so that they can sort of de-escalate what's going on. There are people who work within the clerk's office. They maintain the integrity of our files, make sure that we are open to the public. They make sure that they are the people who can take what the public is bringing in, bring it to the appropriate person. They are here in my court every day, writing down everything that happens so that there can be an accurate record of what happened in my court that the public can go look to. There are, we have a law librarian who offers insight and information to people who need packets of paperwork to be filing. We have court administration who makes sure that our lights are on. And we have, I have half of them. That's an upgrade from last week. And so we have, within the court system, we have probation and probation officers who work to ensure that people are given services so that they can sort of better themselves and better their lives and make better decisions in the future. We have, so many assistants and so many people who make sure that I'm at least where I'm supposed to be at any given time. They keep the trains running on time and make sure that we actually can see everyone that we intend to. And so, let's see, who am I skipping, Kip? Oh yeah, we have IT people without whom I wouldn't have all of this happening, which is just magic to me. I have a Zoom courtroom because they made that happen about a year ago, and I am so grateful that I have been able to see people in my courtroom even when they are practicing in Phoenix. And so I think that there is so much that is to be done here and can be done here, and it is such a help to the court. And so,
as to job fair, do you have anything else you would like for me to cover, or is there anyone else who is anticipated to speak?
oh yeah, okay.
Thank you.
We have our job fair or our job openings. We have openings on our Mohave County Courts website, and it's mohavecourts.com. And there are so many ways that people can sort of get involved in helping through the courts. And those are not just adversarial type jobs for lawyers. Those are jobs for people who want to come in and sort of make sure that the court runs on time and make sure everything is going well. And so, Kip, did you want to speak?
No, I think you covered it well.
I
Probation is a huge department. Where there's a lot of people going on in probation. Do you want to say anything later?
I would just add that we talked a lot about the different types of court hearings you guys here, but we also have specialty courts within the probation department. So we, at least with juvenile probation, we have a juvenile health and wellness court that was implemented a couple of years ago to help children who are struggling with their mental health and getting the services that they need within our community. So we're trying to bridge the gap between those services and meeting their needs. We also have a juvenile drug treatment court where we have juveniles who are struggling with substance abuse come in. We're also trying to get them the appropriate services they need, but also have some judicial oversight each week to ensure that they're complying with court orders while obtaining sobriety and maintaining that. On the adult side, we have adult drug court right now. There's a veterans court. So we do a lot more than just make sure clients are complying with court orders. We do try to bridge that gap with services, especially in a rural community. Anything?
Judge, the only other thing I'd mention is we have people that handle finances. So we have people that have accounting backgrounds, that have skills in that area. So you can come to the court and find a job with a myriad of backgrounds, like you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Right, so.
And so with that, thank you all for being here. I'm really appreciating that there were actual human faces in my courtroom that I could talk to, because it is very hard to do this with no one, because I've done this recorded and it feels very strange to just talk to an empty room and be like, there are people, they will probably laugh when I make that joke. And so with that, I thank everyone who has been present here today. And that's all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had 8,000 viewers.